Residents will experience reduced water supply for about 54 hours from Monday. Now, this is while some areas will experience water cuts for the duration. Now, Rand Water says that this is part of a planned pipeline shutdown, which will affect 4 of its systems. Communities across major Gauteng municipalities, including the city of Johannesburg, Mogale City and the Emfuleni municipality, will experience disruptions of water, and this is for about 3 days. The bulk water utility says stationary and roaming water tankers will be made available where possible. All right, that brings us to our talking point this afternoon, the discussion that we are going to have around these water interruptions in Gauteng. The scheduled repair will basically take place starting Monday. Just how dire is our water situation? To have this discussion now, I'm joined by water expert, Dr. Anthony Turton, and we are also joined by Mahlamela Mehlo. This is the COO of the Rand Water, and Gillian Maree, a senior researcher at the Gauteng City Region observatory. To all of you, thank you so much for your time this afternoon for this important discussion. I want to start with you, Mr. Mehlo, and I want to begin with the interruptions that people or residents in Gauteng are going to start experiencing. Are we going to see reduced water interruptions, or are we going to have a total shutdown, or should we say power cuts as far as water is concerned?
Well, good afternoon, colleague. Good afternoon to the viewers at home and your guests as well. We're talking about a shutdown in the technical term. It's a widely used term that describes that a portion of a system will be isolated for purposes of maintenance. This by no means is an expression of our intention to cut the water supply. So the water will be flowing in our system. In fact, to put it in context, the reduction that you referred to, colleague, is only 14% of our water supply, our daily supply as Rand Water, from 4,400 million litres per day that we supply. We will only be reducing by 600 million litres per day, and only one system will be affected, and that is the Vereeniging system, where the raw water supply is actually being connected.
Yeah. Let me ask you a follow-up question before I go to the other guests. Talk to us about what necessitated this interruption or shutdown, in your words.
Well, Tolly, this is routine, really, where you build infrastructure that you are augmenting your network. That infrastructure that is built has to be connected into the network for that infrastructure to begin to be live. We are operating a vast network, over 3,500 kilometers of pipeline, and it's a single network in that sense. So when we build infrastructure of this nature, we do all the preparatory work, we lay the lines, and the final phase of this kind of an augmentation program is when now infrastructure is tied in to the existing infrastructure for it to begin to get to be live.
All right, let's come to you, Ms. Maree, from the GCRO. Recently, you published a study on the quality of life, and part of its findings was that there is an increase in interruptions and dissatisfaction as far as water services are concerned. How does this affect the people of the Gauteng province, and specifically the identified municipality? And I have a vested interest in Johannesburg because this is where you say there has been more reports of water interruptions.
Yes, good afternoon. afternoon, and thank you for including me. We concluded our quality of life survey earlier this year, and it had a look at 13,600 odd residents and asked a range of questions around experiences within Gauteng, and a couple of them relate to water, as you mentioned. So the first is the good news that in Gauteng, the bulk of people do have access to potable water within their homes. The challenge that we have is the reliability of that supply. And what we saw this time around is that a third, so 33% of all the respondents said they'd experienced water cuts on a monthly basis. So that is fairly high, and it has increased substantially from the previous survey. The other statistic that we did notice is that there has been a 10% decline since the 2016 survey in the number of respondents who think that their water is clean. So only 75% of respondents think that the water is clean in Gauteng.
Yeah.
Now, this translates, I think, what you're getting to is it translates into confidence of government to be able to provide services, particularly when we see, as what we have seen this time around, is not just in water, but in other services as well, is increasing service disruptions, which is incredibly disruptive for people who live within Gauteng.
Absolutely. And this is where we bring in Dr. Anthony Turton. Dr. Turton, if you can hear us, you're joining us on the line. And just latching on to what Gillian was saying, that the concern for residents is the issue of reliability of supply. But you have been quoted as saying that this is actually good news, that this shutdown is indicative of a well-run entity. What are you basing that on?
Well, yes, good afternoon to you and the listeners. The simple reality is that we need planned maintenance, and what Rand Water is doing is something that they are required to do and they have to do. So I think we should be supportive of that. But what we need to understand is that water is an enormously complex value chain across the entire supply chain, from the extracting water from the river, which was what Rand Water does, processing that water to potable quality standards, then distributing it through thousands of kilometers of bulk water pipeline, and eventually on-selling it to the different municipalities, of which Johannesburg is only one of them. Rand Water supplies water as far afield as Rustenburg and Pretoria and Secunda, and it's got a very, very large footprint. In fact, it's one of the largest bulk water suppliers in the world. That's a simple fact about Rand Water. So, while we might want to be angry with Rand Water at this point in time, it's actually not Rand Water's fault. Rand Water is doing what they should be doing. But it speaks to another issue, and that is the issue of the overall status of the infrastructure across the entire value chain. And, of course, a lot of that is to do with the municipal infrastructure. And I just might add that I did some commercial consulting work a while back for some commercial property developers in South Africa. People constructing commercial real estate for rental to businesses, etc. And they were in a situation where their future investments were increasingly at risk because of the unreliability or the probability of shutdowns. You must remember, when we have an unreliable water supply, there are many unintended consequences that happen, and just one of the unintended consequences is that your risk of fire increases dramatically because your commercial buildings are unable to support a fire hydrants if a fire should break out.
Yeah.
So there are many, many unintended consequences. Another one of them, of course, is your disruption in your sewage flows. That is something that can be anticipated after an extended disruption of water of the magnitude that we are seeing now this coming week.
All right, Dr. Turton, let's pause there for a moment, and a very interesting point you're bringing up there, that with the interruption of water supply then comes on the risk of fires. And when we return, as much as you're saying this is good news for the security of water for the province of Gauteng, but how will all of this unfold come tomorrow? We continue the conversation in a moment. You're watching the Talking Point, and we are discussing the major water interruptions that we are going to start experiencing here in the province of Gauteng starting tomorrow. And we have for this discussion the water expert, Dr. Anthony Turton, who talks to us via the phone. We also have Mr. Mahlamela Mehlo, the COO at Rand Water, and Gillian Maree, who is a senior researcher at the Gauteng City Region observatory. Well, let's pick up with you, Mr. Mehlo. You've heard what Dr. Turton had to say about the water interruptions, which could increase the risk of fires. And that brings me to my question about whether you are going to have available water supply should fires break out. But more importantly, let's talk about what time are these interruptions expected to start tomorrow. I heard the hour of 5 a.m. How does it all unfold?
Yes, thanks, Dolly. Firstly, let me just touch on the points that Prof. Turton has actually mentioned. And he's quite correct. If you look at the developments as you drive around along your R21s, you see a lot of developments, you know, and the first question as I drive around, I ask myself, where is the water going to come from for all these developments? So in the main, we are also faced with a challenge of having to plan for a moving target. As we know that there is a shortage of water from the Vaal River itself. However, the developments are not necessarily waiting for that Lesotho Phase 2 project to kick in. So we're talking about a finite resource in the sense that it's not just finite from the resource point of view, it's also finite in terms of the infrastructure that is meant to actually meet those demands. And Prof is also quite correct in also highlighting the dangers that come with the overusage of water then in that sense. So the water issue becomes complex in that sense. I would also like to confirm, Dolly, that our water is SANS 241 compliant at all material times. It would have been nice to see maybe the data that Ms. Maree is actually referring to, but from a rainwater point of view, really, we can assure you that our water is clean. We've got a state-of-the-art laboratory in Vereeniging that tests the water daily, and when you go to sites and plants, this water is actually tested on hourly basis.
Yeah.
And the issue of water cuts, you know, a third of water cuts. Remember, we are operating two systems. That from rainwater point of view, the system that we operate, certainly we're not talking about system failures that would account for a third of water cuts. As Prof also mentioned, the fact that if you look at the two networks, we are operating a 3,500 kilometer network. If you compare that to the municipality networks, those run into 12,000, 13,000, which means it's actually a much, much bigger network that municipalities and metros are actually running. So the water cuts then have to really be then really broken down according to those networks.
Yeah.
But coming to the shutdown, Tolly, you're right. The shutdown will start at 5 a.m. tomorrow morning. There are three stages, if you like, that we are actually keeping our eye on. Firstly, we need to isolate and empty the line. It's a huge line. We're talking here 2.1 meters in diameter. So it's going to take quite a while to actually empty. We are emptying, we are scouring, so there will be valves that will be open to let the water run out. But we are also putting in pumps that will start to draw the water and pump out from the chambers. So that is going to take us roughly around 5 to 8 hours. Once we achieve that, we need to start cutting the pipes, cut out the pieces that have to be replaced by the valve rigs. And once the cutting out is done, we will lower the rigs, weld them in place, test to make sure that everything is okay, and then start to charge the line.
All right. Before I go to Maree, Ms. Maree, in a moment, Mr. Mehlo, let's stick with you very quickly. So the areas, for example, that will start experiencing a total cut-off, is that where your water tankers will be stationed so that people are taken care of?
Well, let me start by saying, Dolly, that a system is not obviously going to be depleted as soon as we start isolating. Mm-hmm. There will still be water in the system. In fact, we have ensured that for the past 2 weeks, we focus on nothing but to ensure that we raise the reservoir levels, the storage levels, so that we minimize the impact as the water starts to be depleted from the system. Your higher lying areas will be the first ones to start feeling the impact. And in conjunction with the municipalities, you will remember that the responsibility actually to supply water at the reticulation level is that of the municipalities. However, we have partnered with the municipalities throughout, and those that have indicated to us that they will not have the ability to place tankers, we as Rainwater have actually taken it upon ourselves, even though it's the municipality's responsibility to make sure that we get those tankers on standby, and of course prioritizing critical infrastructure such as your hospitals, your clinics, and so forth.
Yeah. All right. Ms. Maree, let's bring you back into the conversation. So earlier you raised the issue of reliability of supply, which is people's major worry. What about the cleanliness of water, the quality of water that is provided by Rainwater? You heard Mr. Mehlo there saying that it would be interesting to hear the data from your side as to the quality of the water that is given to us.
I'm afraid we don't keep data on the quality of water. What we do ask is people's perceptions of water. And I think the points that have been raised are really important, that we have world-class water that comes from Rainwater, and it is of the utmost highest standards. But there is an enormous amount of infrastructure from the resource, from where it's abstracted, to how people receive that water, depending on where you live and how you live. And there are a number of points along that where there could be problems. People might not necessarily have a tap in their home to receive water. And that's where the issue of water quality arises. Certainly we do see people becoming more and more concerned with water quality and water security over a number of years, but it becomes a lot more complex when we're talking about, people's lived experiences within a household. And unfortunately for that, we don't have exact data. We rely on people providing us what their perspective is on their own experiences. Yeah,
just how fast and furious, Gillian, have these reports around whether it be the bursting of the pipes or the water leakages, and you name them. Your report suggesting that at least in Johannesburg alone, 55,000 reports of such issues when it comes to water supply.
So I'm not quite sure of that statistics. The statistics we have, we reported on a percentage-wise around what proportion of households have experienced that. In Johannesburg, what we did see is that the last time we did the survey in 2018, 27% of households said they'd experienced water interruptions a minimum of once a month, and that's risen by 10% to 37% in Johannesburg. And that is a substantial increase. Yeah. And it is something we should be concerned about. And the reason why we're concerned about it at a household level is because water isn't like electricity. And I suppose that's why people are very worried about the water cuts that we're going to experience now. There's many alternatives for electricity. We don't necessarily have easy alternatives for water, and it's so intrinsically linked to everything that we do in a society that's experienced an enormous amount of pressure the last 18 months as well. So I think that's where a lot of the concerns and the worries are coming from.
All right, let's bring Dr. Turton back into the conversation. Dr. Turton, so this major maintenance work that is going to be conducted by Rainwater, I was just reading the paper today quoting Eddie Singo, who is the executive manager at Rainwater, and he is saying that this maintenance is going to ensure that Gauteng's water needs are met well past the year 2040. Should we take him at his word, or might we factor in other major issues that we might see in the future?
Okay, well, the simple reality is that South Africa is a fundamentally water-constrained economy as of 2002. We ran into the finite limit of the amount of water we have available. And it's my understanding that Rand Water at this moment in time is pumping to the full limits of its legal license. So these are the facts of the matter. Now, if Rand Water is already pumping to the full limit of its license, but the cities of Johannesburg and the entire greater conurbation from the East Rand all the way through to the West Rand is still continuing to grow. The simple reality is that something has to give. We cannot sustain a complex city like Johannesburg and Pretoria and all the other cities along the Waterfront with what is regarded as a finite resource. This is the simple reality of the matter. And of course, it gets more complicated if we understand that Johannesburg is the only city in the world not on a river, not on a lake, not on a waterfront. It's on a continental watershed divide. So all the water that you see used in the entire Gauteng area has to be pumped uphill with energy from Eskom, and we know what's happening to Eskom at the moment. Yeah. So without any question of doubt, water security is increasingly becoming a problem. And while it's laudable for Rand Water to say that they are planning for the future, this is what they are expected to do, and they must continue to do that, and we certainly support them in that. However, the spokesperson said something just now about, he mentioned the fact that water is a finite resource. This is where I will differ quite strongly. Water is not a finite resource. Water is an infinitely renewable resource. And this is where the future of South Africa lies, and in particular the future of Gauteng. Because if we continue regarding water as a finite resource, then I'm afraid Gauteng has grown to the maximum amount of its expansion, and from now on it can either just maintain what it is or slowly start to crumble around the edges. But in reality, water is an infinitely renewable resource, and there's a number of technologies that's coming onto the market today that makes the recycling of water not only technically viable, but also economically feasible. So we are going to be seeing in the not too distant future the emergence of things called independent water producers, and Rand Water is likely to fill the role of that independent water producer. And they will not only get their water from the river, because at the moment the river is in any event increasingly polluted by sewage. So they are already getting into the business of treating partly sewage contaminated water. But in the future we're going to start investing significant amount of capital and technology into all of our wastewater works. We have 825 of them plus minus in South Africa, and they are all going to have to be recapitalized over the next decade and converted into water recovery plant. And the same is going to happen with mine water. I might just add that there's another important thing here. We're talking now about the shutdown of water, but Gillian Maree is talking about water quality. These are completely different matters. And I just draw attention to a study that was done by Department of Water and Sanitation a while ago called the Vaal River Salinity Study, which is a highly credible study that speaks to the fact that the Vaal River system, which is an extremely important system from an economic perspective, is increasingly becoming saline. And the reason why it's becoming saline is sewage return flows into the river, but also the return flow of acidic mine water. So we are going to have to start investing in the very near future into recovery plants from both of those sources. And of course, the good news is that the technology is available, and the even better news is that there is capital that is willing to go into those projects. So this is what actually makes us a kind of good news story, because we are really on the inflection point of transitioning from, let's call it the old management paradigm where we viewed water as a scarce and limiting resource, to a new paradigm where we consider water to be an economic enabler, but also as an infinitely renewable source that can theoretically be recycled many, many times. It's just subject, of course, to certain provisos, and one of them is the social acceptability of that. Yeah. But from a technical and financial perspective, that is entirely possible.
Sure. Such incredible points you've just made there, Prof. There's so many of them to tackle, and we're going to do that shortly after this. Mr. Mehlo, you might want to prepare yourself, because if Gauteng does not have its own water resources, and it basically relies on pumped water from places or countries like Lesotho, just how well managed is that Vaal River system then that pumps water to all of us who live in Gauteng? That discussion in a moment. Politics Unscripted, the segment of the show, the talking point, and we are discussing the water interruptions that you are going to start experiencing if you live in Gauteng. It starts tomorrow, 5 a.m. is when you might start seeing less water pressure on your tap. Now, let's bring into the conversation the COO at Rand Water, Mr. Mahlamela Mehlo. Mr. Mehlo, you've heard Dr. Turton there just before the break talking about sewage and acid mine water that seeps into the river, the Vaal River water system, and that talks to issues of contamination. Just how well maintained is that system? Keep in mind that we are told Gauteng mainly relies on water pumped from Lesotho, for example, and so Gauteng does not have its own water systems, so to speak.
Yes, thanks, Polly. The Prof is quite right. We are landlocked, and we are supplying water to areas that are landlocked in the main. We don't have the luxury of starting to use your reverse osmosis to start to purify water, your seawater in the main. So the importance of actually maintaining what we have is clearly, finds expression in that kind of a statement. But let me also say, Polly and Prof, I will invite you just to come and have a chat with us at Rand Water, speaking broadly around the reclamation processes that we have in Rand Water. And precisely coming from that same realization that we're not necessarily getting the raw water at the rate that is matching the developments. And as Rand Water, we've looked at quite a number of scenarios from your reclamation to the exploration of underground water, your mine fisher water, your acid mine drainages. We've got quite a number of programs, Polly, that are looking at how best can we start to bring all those sources into our water sources. And certainly I will invite the Prof then to come and have a look and have a chat around that.
Yeah.
But again, we will agree to disagree with Prof, because the context within which I'm using water as a finite resource finds expression in the landscape that South Africa actually has, in as far as infrastructure is concerned, in as far as the cost of production is concerned. Scientifically, the Prof is correct. Water is actually a infinite renewable resource. If you look at your rain cycle, the water just evaporates and it comes back down to earth through your rains. So there is no water really that is lost, but we're talking about the lay of the land in terms of our infrastructure, which comes from centuries, as far as centuries ago, and how do we produce this water? And in that context, water is finite, because we cannot afford, some of the technologies that the Prof is talking about. Of course, that is a technology that we are beginning to adopt, but we are looking at the cost. And as we run a water entity like Rand Water, the first thing that we always keep in mind is passing on the cost to the end consumer. And that tariff is regulated, which means there is only so much we can actually do in introducing quite a number of these niceties that the Prof is referring to. And certainly we're not worried about the water IPPs, Prof, simply because we believe that our programs are so much ahead that we are going to start to see Rand Water building the reclamation plants, Rand Water exploring these mine fisher waters. And this is part of our forward thinking, with the understanding that we are getting water from Lesotho through the integrated Vaal River system. The other point, Polly, that is not spoken of here, which is quite critical. close to 30 to 35% of the water that we purify, that we produce and supply to the customers, goes towards wastage. And we are beginning to say, if we are going to unlock a lot of these economic activities, a lot of that water that is wasted, and as we already made that distinction between the network that we operate and the network that is in the municipality spaces, you can clearly see with the vast networks that are in the municipality spaces, that is where the wastage is happening in terms of the leaks, the bursts, and all of that.
Yeah.
So there is a lot of water that can actually be saved. And if we save that water, we actually delay some of these infrastructure augmentation projects that are actually supposed to take us to 2040, as Eddie had made that point, Colin.
All right. Ms. Maree, let's bring you back into the conversation. 30 to 35% of water produced by Rand Water goes to wastage. I don't know whether you have looked into that element, in particular the role of municipalities when you conducted your quality of life survey. What is the role of municipalities when it comes to preventing the water losses we see?
Municipalities are incredibly important because they're responsible for the distribution of water, to making sure that water gets into each and every household, and then also making sure that sanitation is taken care of so that waste is flushed away, treated as well. If you may, though, I just want to just try and contextualize what we're talking about, because we're in Gauteng, we're a province of over 15 million people. And that growth that we're talking about, I think it's worth just putting a couple of numbers to it, because then we can understand that wastage within the bigger picture. We did a piece of work around water security in Gauteng, and what we had a look at is the population grows within Gauteng about 1.5 million people every 5 years. That's roughly the number of people who live in Soweto. So that's the number of people every 5 years that come into Gauteng. It is also the hub of the South African economy. There's a very high demand for water. So regardless of wastage, regardless of what the capped water is at the moment, we have to augment the supply in Gauteng. And I don't think this is a choice of how much water we have or whether we use our water more responsibly. Because we're a water scarce part of the world, we have to do both. So we have to both increase the augmentation. So the work that Rand Water is doing, the work that the National Department is doing for Lesotho Highlands Phase 2 is incredibly important. And we need to keep an eye and put pressure on these entities and make sure that we're augmenting supply. But then I fully agree with the spokesperson that we also have to make sure that we're not using water wastefully. And unfortunately, in this part of the world, we do use water very wastefully. So the last statistics that I saw is we almost use nearly at a per capita level, nearly double the global average of per capita water per day in a part of the world where we have half the global rainfall.
Sure.
So we need to find ways to work a little bit. We need to be smarter in how we use water. And that's both fixing the leaks. And I certainly do think, given the water interruptions that we reported on earlier, we have to manage that. But we also need to, at a commercial and a domestic level, start using alternative sources of water for watering our gardens and for filling our swimming pools. So that fantastically clean water that we're getting from Rand Water needs to be used for domestic use and essential use first. So there's so many scales that we can start asking these questions.
All right. When we return, Dr. Turton, just prepare yourself to answer questions around climate change. We are a water-scarce country, and as we battle things like climate change, how will we be affected in a country like South Africa? And already, Mr. Mehlo, you can also prepare yourself to answer questions about where people can find information on these water cuts. Someone asking that question on Twitter. We continue the conversation as we wrap it up in a moment. You watching Politics Unscripted, the segment of the show, the talking point, and under discussion are water interruptions that we are going to start seeing from tomorrow. This is expected to go on for 3 days, and so we are here to try and give you as much information as is possible in order to cope for the next 3 days. My panelists, Dr. Anthony Turton, he is a water expert, Mahlamela Mehlo, COO of Rand Water, that's the bulk water supplier, and Gillian Maree, a senior researcher at the Gauteng City Region Observatory. Dr. Turton, let's come to you quickly. The issue of climate change, how will it affect our water resources? Maybe factor into that response, Prof, the matters around municipalities who are responsible for supplying water to the end user, which is me and you. For some time, you have been talking about issues of corruption over and above the issues of water leakages.
Yes, thank you. There's many questions that you asked there, so let me just break it down if I can, please. Can I first just respond to Mr. Mehlo's notion there about technology? Technology is driving the cost of water down. I'm speaking now as a member of the SA Business Water Chamber. We work closely with the presidency, with the with Treasury, with various other stakeholders, the Development Bank, etc. And we are closely monitoring the whole idea of technology. And without any question of doubt, the technology platforms coming to South Africa at the moment now are driving the cost of water treatment down, not up. So it's a fallacy to say that who's going to pay the cost, because the cost is going to get lower. And in any event, from a purely economic perspective, as we run into the finite limits of our resource, the cost of producing that last drop of water goes up infinitely. That's simple economics 101. So the actual cost of production will increase if we don't do anything about it.